This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. My guest today, Bruce Ferber, is an Emmy and Golden Globe-nominated comedy writer-producer whose credits include Bosom Buddies, Coach, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and Home Improvement, where he served as executive producer and showrunner. Bruce's first novel, Elevating Overman, was released in 2012 and is attached as a potential TV series with actor Jason Alexander. His second novel, Cascade Falls, released in 2015, won the Foreword Indie Book of the Year Gold Prize for Humor and Bronze Prize for General Fiction. Bruce Ferber's upcoming anthology, The Way We Work on the Job in Hollywood, provides a window into the skill sets and the insanity that make movies and television tick. Essays by award-winning writers, directors, and producers, as well as interviews with executives and below-the-line crew members, paint a picture that often presents as Studs Terkel's working only on acid. For those reasons and so many more, I'm beyond honored and truly thrilled to welcome to StoryBeat today the great writer Bruce Ferber. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the amazing introduction.
Well, you know,
I need that every day in all aspects of my life.
Don't we all? Wouldn't it be great if we woke up that way?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I could have you just introducing me on a daily basis. It would be fantastic.
There you go. Let's talk about how you got into this whole thing. What were your earliest inspirations? How did you become a writer in the first place?
You know, I had always dabbled in writing. I think I got my first sort of taste of it, believe it or not, from an English composition class I took.
Really?
This was over the summer at Andover Academy outside of Boston. Now, I didn't attend Andover. I wasn't a private school guy, but one summer my parents sent me to, basically they had like a college prep program, and it was required that everyone take an English composition class. And the instructor said, you know what, you can write. And I never forgot that. And the guy, he just always was present in my mind and made me think about how I felt when I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sort of stuck with me. And then I thought I was going to be an English major. And I was an English major for 1 year. I went to college in Ohio for a year at a place called Ohio Wesleyan.
Right.
And this was at a time when, you know, this was in 1971, 71. And sort of the world was exploding, but people at Ohio Wesleyan didn't really know it. They were in their fraternities and sororities, and it was just not my kind of scene. So I was desperate to get out of there. I liked the classes, and I wanted to go drop out and live on a farm with my friends, and I was either going to do that or transfer to another college, and my parents said, why don't you try another college? So I was thinking about film and television, where I had film classes as part of my English classes in high school. I went to a place called Herrick's High School on Long Island.
Right.
We had really inventive English teachers who brought foreign films into the class and really gave us a sense of filmmaking as an art. So I called these friends of mine who had transferred to NYU, and I said, they had been at NYU, and told them I was considering transferring. And I said, well, how do you like it there? And they said, we love it. And, you know, I just did it. I applied, I got in, and suddenly I was in NYU Film School.
Wow.
And, and I would have to say that the focus there was a lot on production in those days.
Sure.
And writing was not really emphasized. I mean, there were classes, but only a couple, and we were kids who were thrilled to have cameras and editing machines, and and be in New York City, and we felt like we could make films just because we knew how to work the equipment.
Right.
And the writing was something that people needed to learn how to do better.
Was this before or after Scorsese?
This was right after Scorsese.
Okay.
He had just left to go to California. He was starting to blow up, and it was right after that I got in there.
Well, you went right to the cream of the crop. You went right to the very top of the educational world in film.
Well, in those days, this is what was interesting. There were not a lot of film schools. It was basically NYU and USC were the two big places. UCLA had a program, but it was not as well regarded as USC.
Right.
And then I think SMU in Dallas had a program. Boston had their communication schools. But as far as film schools went, it was NYU and USC.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, not only was I thrown right into the thick of it, it was right in the middle of New York City. So you didn't even feel like you were a student. You felt like you were working, at a job.
Yeah, and were you always focused on comedy back then? Because I know that's where your bread and butter is.
No, I mean the comedy thing. I mean, I was always funny, and some of the stuff I wrote was comedic early on, but the comedy thing really, it became, when I started to write early screenplays, they were comic. But how I started writing comedy for television was when I moved to California and I saw friends of mine having some success in TV comedy.
Mm-hmm.
It was really hard to get established as a feature screenwriter coming out of college.
Well, still is.
I didn't have the first inkling of how to do it, but having a couple of friends get some success writing sitcoms made me think, well, maybe I could do that. So I just started writing specs, and in those days, it wasn't like it is now, where you have 12,000 film schools churning out people who want to do this.
Right.
In those days, in Hollywood, if you wrote a good spec script, you could get it read. And if people liked it, suddenly you got meetings, and the next thing you knew, you were working. So that's how it happened for me.
So it was, I don't want to say it was easier, but it was probably just less volume of people in competition.
Exactly, and I think it was easier in that not only were there fewer people, but the path was a lot clearer. Once somebody told you how they got in, you just kind of followed what they did and got in the same way. You wrote your spec scripts, got it to everybody you knew, they got it to everybody they knew. The next thing you knew, you had an agent, and the next thing you knew, you were getting meetings, and if you were any good, you kept working.
Did it help that you were an NYU grad? Was there a mafia of sorts out there at that time?
There was a mafia, but not in sitcom. The mafia was in film. A lot of the NYU graduates wound up at the AFI, and these were people like Marty Brest and Amy Heckerling. They went from NYU to the AFI,
mm-hmm.
where they were introduced to Hollywood in a big way. They got to make more films at the AFI, and the Scorsese kind of legacy, led to Marty Brest and in some sense, Amy Heckerling,
mm-hmm.
and that was the real mafia, and I was not a part of that.
So who were you admiring in those days? Who did you look up to as an artist?
At what point in my career?
When you started to, obviously you started to find work writing comedy because you saw that as an opportunity. And so who were you emulating or admiring or looking up to in those days?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I got out of NYU, I wanted to work in movies.
Right.
And the people I admired were the people like Scorsese and Peter Bogdanovich. You know, my favorite films at the time, I think, were Mean Streets, The Last Picture Show, and The French Connection.
All heavy dramas.
They were dramas, and they were just great filmmaking, and they were powerful. They were visual, and that's kind of where my head was at when I came out to California. Even though I didn't see myself writing those kinds of films, although I really did relate to the small dramas like The Last Picture Show.
Right.
I couldn't see myself writing action movies, but I could see myself writing movies about relationships and families in troubled situations, and I could see myself doing that. But those opportunities weren't there for me at that time.
Isn't that what most of the successful sitcoms of the world are? They're family dramas turned on their head. They
are. But I was not really thinking about sitcoms when I first came out here.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I always tell people that when I started watching sitcoms, my favorite sitcom was All in the Family.
Right.
And I related to it because I grew up in New York, and I kind of knew people like that. And then when I watched shows like the Mary Tyler Moore Show, as well written as they were, they felt artificial to me because I couldn't relate to that experience.
Right.
A woman making her way in the workplace in the real world could relate to that, very much. But for me, it wasn't. Part of it was that it wasn't. It was very white bread to me, and I loved the way All in the Family got into ethnicity, and that's later became something that I got into when I started writing novels.
Into ethnicity?
To writing about ethnic characters, my own background, and really getting specific as opposed to just trying to make it relatable to everyone.
Yeah, it was all broad brush back then. It wasn't very specific, and All in the Family was very specific.
Very specific.
And
those were the kind of characters that really interested me from the get-go.
Well, Norman Lear certainly had his pulse on where things were headed. That's for sure.
Yeah,
because right at that time the world was about to explode off in a different direction, and he almost sort of sensed it. You could tell when you look back; it was like right there. What was the first job that you received payment for? How did you start?
Well, when I first came to L.A., I started as a production assistant, and the first job I worked on a movie called Death Race 2000.
Oh, yes.
That was directed by Paul Bartel.
Yes.
And Paul, his dad knew my dad knew his dad.
I see.
And when I came out to California, he said, "Look this guy up." And so I looked him up, and he was the nicest man in the world. And I looked him up, and he said, I'm starting a movie soon, and maybe you want to come work on it. A bunch of us are going to dinner tonight. Why don't you meet us? So I met them at this place that no longer exists called the Magic Pan in Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
It was a crepe restaurant. And Paul offered me a job. He said, "I can't pay you, but come and work. It's a 2-week shoot." So I worked for the first week as a production assistant and driving around David Carradine and Sylvester Stallone. And then the second week, I had been so good that they paid me $40. So that was my first job in Hollywood.
So your first gig was for $40.
Yeah.
You've definitely doubled your income at some point.
Yes.
Okay.
And after that,
yeah.
I was smart enough to kind of figure out how to do it. And first of all, in those days, L.A. was cheap. It was not like New York, which has always been expensive.
Right.
In the mid-'70s, when I came out, you could rent something. I was living at one point in a house in Santa Monica, a little tiny guest cottage, for $150 a month. So the way I sort of fashioned my life is I would take these jobs as an assistant editor because I had learned how to do that pretty well at NYU, and there were a lot of jobs available there, and you didn't didn't have to get somebody to like a script. You just had to say, well, I know how to work a moviola and work with soundtracks and all this stuff, and you could get hired. So
Sure.
what I would do, and this was sort of the beginning of my writing adventure, I figured out that I could take an assistant editing job, work for 6 months, and then for the next 6 months collect unemployment insurance, which I looked at as kind of my national endowment grant to write. And that's what I did. So I kind of just switched off. So I would do my editing gig, and then I would, work on a screenplay. And then when unemployment started to run out, I would start, making calls, and then I'd get another job, and then I'd write again. And this went on for a couple of years. And within that time is when I started to write spec sitcoms. And shortly after that, I got my first assignment, which was on Bosom Buddies.
And that was as a freelance job, not
yes.
not a staff job, obviously.
Correct.
And how many spec scripts would you say you wrote before that once that went in and turned the tide?
The one half-hour spec scripts, I wrote one.
One.
I wrote a bunch of features, but I wrote one half-hour spec for MASH that got around to different people in town, and then I wound up hooking up as a partner with an old friend of mine from NYU, and he had actually sold some things before that and maybe worked on a show or two. So then he and I got called into Bosom Buddies. But I had, developed some amount of cred with that one script, and he and I together were able to get in the door and start working.
Would you say that has the world of writing a spec sitcom that exists and yet letting that be your calling card, that has sort of changed over to where people are looking for original voices rather than, can you do this show?
Yes, it totally has changed. And, for a while back, people were saying, well, you need a script of a current show and an original pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And then showrunners got so bored of reading these spec episodes of existing shows that they said, no, just give me a pilot. Show me you can write something that will make me pay attention. And that became the standard, I guess. And, there are good and bad parts of that. I mean, I am a huge fan of hiring people who have an original voice.
Mm-hmm.
But it also, when someone is writing your show, and I write about this in the new anthology, I write about how when you work on somebody else's show, a lot of it is being a mimic, especially with a comedy.
Well, sure.
That you are being paid to try and imitate Larry David's voice,
right?
so-and-so's voice. And it's a very strange job. It's very strange because nobody gets into this business to try and mimic somebody. Your original instinct in being a writer is basically that you think you have something to say.
What?
So how do you do that when you're constantly working on other people's shows?
Right. Well, in my classes, I teach that you have to learn how to work within that sandbox. I call it the sandbox. And that,
right.
that you can go to the edges of that sandbox, but you can't go outside of it, really. And you do need to understand those characters and how that world works and how that showrunner works.
Right.
Or you're not going to sell anything. So, yeah, that is very strange if you think about it, that you're trying to be like somebody else rather than yourself.
It's really strange, and if I'm a showrunner and all I'm doing is reading specs, all I'm doing is reading spec pilots, how do I know that writer
mm-hmm.
can do what I need that writer to do?
Yeah, that's
so it's really strange. So I guess what I might do if I were running a show today is if the writer were an experienced writer who had worked on many staffs, I'd like to read something original.
Right.
And if the writer is first starting out, I think I'd probably want to read both.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. So you alluded to the book that's about to come out, The Way We Work, On the Job in Hollywood. So
right.
what brought you to write it? What led you that way?
It's a really kind of interesting story because many moons ago, after spending 20 plus years in writers' rooms, I started thinking about all the stories that people had about Hollywood and just absurd stuff. And I thought, man, I'd love to do a documentary called One Hollywood Story, where I go around to all these people I know, and they each tell one. They can only tell one story. And I thought this was the greatest idea ever until I realized what it would look like, which would be like a lot of people who look kind of like me, just talking to the camera.
Right.
And it would be pretty static and pretty boring to look at. And then I thought, oh, well, maybe I could just, mix it up with clips and stuff. And then I realized, well, the clips would cost a fortune to get from Warner Brothers and Sony and, whatever. So I just shelved the whole idea. And then years later, I was asked to write an essay for an anthology called Los Angeles in the 1970s. And I talked about first coming here and what the town was like back then as opposed to what it is like now, which is it's completely transformed. And in doing that, a light bulb went off and said, wait a minute, what if I do my Hollywood documentary as a book? And then I sort of kind of tweaked it from the One Hollywood Story thing to, I enjoyed writing the essay for the LA 70s book, and I wanted to have some essays in this book. And I thought, let me see if I can round up a bunch of people who are willing to think about something they'd like to write about and have essays about their Hollywood, maybe their one Hollywood experience in this book. And then after that, I started to think about, well, what about all the crew people I worked with? I'd love to include them in some way. Well, most of them don't have the time to sit down and write an essay. Some of them don't have the ability to write an essay. So I came up with this idea that I would do interviews with the below-the-line people and some of the people who did not want to write essays and kind of mix it up. So that's what the book is, above and below the line.
Curiously enough, StoryBeat and your book are on a simpatico level, but in different ways. This show is all about process, how people do what they do. Your book is about the sort of the way people have operated in Hollywood. Yes.
Right, and the things that have happened to them and their response.
I think that's a very interesting take on essentially a Hollywood career or a showbiz career. Tell us some of the highlights. What are some of the highlights of the book?
Oh my God, there are so many in my opinion. There's one essay from a writer that I used to work for on Home Improvement who had come out and become a really hot writer, and he worked on Maude. And through a series of B. Arthur was the star of Maude.
Yeah.
Her husband was Gene Saks, the director, and Gene Saks was best friends with Walter Matthau. My friend somehow was working on Maude, and at the same time asked to write a movie for Gene Saks, which Walter Matthau was supposed to star in. And Elliot Shulman, the guy who wrote the essay, tells this story about how, they went to Universal. Universal was all high on it, and Walter Matthau wanted to do it, and describing Walter Matthau and his quirky personality. He was an inveterate gambler.
Yeah.
And that enters into the story. And they go to Universal. Universal wants to do the movie, and then what happens is that Gene Saks' movie, of Mame with Lucille Ball, comes out, and it tanks. And Walter Matthau, who is Gene Saks' best friend, calls my friend Elliot behind Gene Saks' back to say, "You think we can, boot Gene off the picture? Will you still do it?" And my friend Elliot, who wrote this essay, said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The whole movie was Gene's idea. He hired me." And Walter says, "Well, it wasn't really his idea. You wrote this." He said, "No, it really was his idea." And so Elliot, who was one of the hottest writers in Hollywood then, basically told Walter Matthau that he would not, go behind Gene's back and do this without him. And Walter Matthau passed, and that was that.
Well, the history of both Broadway and books and movies is replete with stories of being booted off of things.
Right.
So all right, talk about the process of putting the book together. How did you sit down and figure out which people you wanted to be in it, or how did it work? How did you put it together?
There was a lot of that, figuring out who I knew. It was one of these things where I'm working with a small press. They don't have upfront money. I can't pay every person who writes an essay.
Right.
So, and when I did my LA in the 70s essay, I did it for free.
Sure.
For a friend of mine. So I started thinking about who do I know who would have an interesting story to tell that could write an essay that I think would be a good addition to the book. So I made a list of that, and then I started looking at the crew sheets of all, the below-the-line people I had worked with over the years, and started reaching out to them. And, a lot of it is haranguing, do you want to do this? Can you do this? They all say yes. You say, well, when can you do it? And, it's an arduous process. It really is, getting it all together.
I imagine it's really arduous.
It is. And then I started thinking about, well, boy, it would be cool if there were essays that existed that not too many people have seen that I could incorporate into the book. Essays by people with names.
Sure.
And according to my publisher, he said if you had 50 big names in this book, the book wouldn't sell any more than if you have 4. He said because after a while the names all blend into one another.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, see what you can find. So I went looking, and I found a whole bunch of stuff. And, I assumed that the publisher would be the one negotiating for these things, and basically he didn't do it. And I thought this book was going to be kind of dead for a while. And then I went about learning how to do this stuff. And one of the things that's in the book is a piece by J.J. Abrams,
right?
Which is basically something that I rewrote from something, or edited from something, a 20-page interview he did in the Producers Guild magazine. And I said, man, if I could take this just one section on how he broke in, people would love to hear this. So I called the Producers Guild and Producers Guild magazine, and the editor, Chris Green, said, well, yeah, we own this, and as far as I'm concerned, it's cool, but I better run it past JJ, like the biggest guy in Hollywood.
Yes.
So, of course, that took a whole lot of time, and I had to keep on it and on it and on it, and finally Chris got back to me and said, JJ's cool with it. And so I got that one. And then another friend of mine had been Robert Towne's agent.
Yeah.
And so he talked to Towne. Towne said, cool, I got that one.
Well, that to me, that's from my personal perspective, that's one of my real heroes is Robert Towne. So you get him, you've got the guy that attracts me to your book. Robert
Towne is, as great as his screenwriting is, when you read this essay, which, again, some people have seen who are old enough to have read it or, read literary journals or whatever, but most people haven't seen it. And, his discussion of screenwriting is just so brilliant. And it's like 1,600 words or something like that. And in that amount of time, he just says a whole lot.
He's to me, he wrote the single greatest scene in the history of movies, but that's just from my perspective. And that's the scene in Chinatown between Jack Nicholson and John Huston when they're at the club and they talk about old buildings, whores, and politicians all becoming respectable with age.
That's right.
That scene is just extraordinary to me. So, all right. So, in the book itself, Did you then went out and interviewed other people?
Well, not just interviewed, but so there were the below the line interviews, and then I went out and petitioned people to write essays for this. So the essays obviously were not interviews.
And they did, and you didn't pay for them. They did this voluntarily.
Right, and they will get something if the book sells.
Sure. And so then you also interviewed below the line people as well.
Correct.
Yeah? And give us some highlights of who the below the line people were, because I find that fascinating. The current, as we're recording this interview, the current guest that I have on StoryBeat is Vincent Jeffords, who is the production designer of 325 episodes of Criminal Minds. I find those people very interesting.
Yeah, one of my people that I loved in this book is the production designer for Arrested Development.
Mm-hmm.
And, that show operated on the most crazy schedules. They never got the script at the last minute. And she describes this process where there was something in the script where David Cross's character is wearing a shirt, and then he stands next to the wallpaper, and his shirt and the wallpaper are the same pattern. So this is one of the gags in the script. And she had they asked her if she could do it, and she said yes, and she had no idea how to do it. And then had to spend all that night figuring out how she was going to put it together.
I saw that episode. It turns out quite brilliantly.
Right.
So, all right, now talk about, once you have all this material, what did you do? Did you then sit down and think, how do I program this? How do I put it in what order or sequence?
Oh, the order and sequence drove me mad. It really did, because there were 41 entries in this book.
Right.
And I changed the order around 100,000 times. I work on a program called Scrivener. I don't know if you work with that.
Sure. Well, I work with the Final Draft, but yes, Scrivener,
right,
I understand.
Of course. But for books, Scrivener, and I work with Screenwriter for scripts, but for books, Scrivener is fantastic in that it allows you to just drag and drop and move chapters around. And so I was dragging and dropping for like 8 months, trying to figure out how to make sense of all this. And then finally, something occurred to me, and I broke up the book into 9 sections.
Mm-hmm.
And the sections are something like, the first section is the story, and then there's one called and the story has 3 or 4 writers, writing about the town is the first piece, and writing about the story, and then JJ is talking about how he wrote Lost and how he really got into writing. And then also in that section, a great piece by a drama writer named Seth Freeman wrote about how you find a story, which is wonderful. That just because something happens to you doesn't make it a story. You need
right.
some twist on it that is going to make it a piece that people are going to respond to and give it conflict.
Well,
so he's in that, and then I have another piece, a writer writing about the world of high concept when he had to write high concept movies. So there's the story, and then there's the icon, which is about people who broke in and got to work with Marty Scorsese, Lucille Ball, and Orson Welles. There's a chapter, interestingly enough, called The Sandbox, which is about actors telling their stories.
Huh. Okay.
There's one called The Shoot, on location, and there's a bunch more. But that's how I wound up finding my way into a structure. And then what I did, I wrote an introduction to each chapter,
mm-hmm.
Basically introducing why this is a chapter and who these people are, and it worked out really well organizationally.
So it's interesting to me. I mean, I'm going to guess that overall the book tells a kind of a story, even though it's not it's not going to be a contiguous beginning, middle, and end. But
right.
But you had to go find that story in order to put the book together.
Yes, I did, and the last chapter, which I have one essay in this book, and it's the last chapter. And the last chapter is called The Struggle, and it's just about how people kind of do this, and there's always something that will get you, in this business, and how you deal with that and move on from that.
I believe that the person that started that's named Murphy.
Yes.
The
law.
Murphy's Law is everywhere.
No one is above the law.
No, that is for sure. So let's talk for a few minutes about sitcom writing, which you're long-term an expert in. So when you worked on, clearly you worked on some of the most beloved TV comedies of all time. For those in the audience, the listeners that don't know what working on a sitcom is like, can you give us sort of just a brief overview of what the world of working on the show is like?
Well, working most of the shows today, with the exception of the Chuck Lorre night on CBS, most of the shows are single camera. There is still some multi-camera. So the multi-camera life is different than the single camera life. But the multi-camera life was pretty uniform, the way it sort of played out among most shows, in that you had a staff of anywhere between 7 and later it got up to like 17, 18 people.
Right.
I never worked on a show with that many writers, but basically the writers come into the writers' room. Everybody pitches story. You talk about the arc for the season. Everybody pitches stories that fall within that arc once everybody agrees on the arc. And people pitch stories. The showrunner decides ultimately which ones he wants to pursue. And then everybody in the room kind of breaks down that story. It's called breaking a story.
Mm-hmm.
And once the story is broken, the writer then goes home and writes an outline and turns that in. And then the writer's room meets again, and we make tweaks to that outline. The writer goes off and writes a first draft, comes back to the writer's room, we give notes, writer writes a second draft, and then after that, it's kind of open season for the writer's room, with the showrunner being the one to decide how much gets rewritten, or what gets tossed out, and that later becomes the draft that you'll bring to the table, which you do on the first day of production.
How would you decide which writer wrote which script? Was it based on their pitch, or was there assignments in that way?
Say that again?
So in other words, you said that it goes off and a script goes off and is written by a writer or a writing team. Who decides which writing team or writer is writing that script? Is it because they pitched it?
The way I worked, if they pitched it and I like it, they write it. Now, there would be some instances where, you might have liked that pitch, but there's another pitch that maybe, let's say I had a pitch that I liked a little more, I might let them write that one, assign that one to them.
And you'd have to balance that. It wasn't like you could give them all to one writer. It would be up to
no.
You'd switch it up.
You balance it among your staff, and the tricky part is when you hire new people and they turn out not to be as good as you thought they would be, and then you wind up not giving them a lot of scripts to do. That gets a little touchy. But usually those people don't make it through the whole season. You have an option to cut them off.
Comedy writers don't have any egos, do they?
Oh my God! One of the most it's kind of everybody has seen almost the stereotype of this, going back to your show of shows.
Yeah, right.
There's a picture of all the writers, hovering over Sid Caesar by the typewriter, and you can imagine them all screaming out their jokes and pitch ideas, and it's very competitive in the writing room, and they can get loud. And as a showrunner, what you learn very quickly is that the loudest idea isn't necessarily the best idea.
Of course.
And so you have to listen closely to your quieter people, and there are always those writers who, you can be mumbling something, and then, you have to say, what did you just say? And then it turns out to be a fantastic joke or great story.
Well, that's the infamous Neil Simon bit from your show of shows, and then My Favorite Year, where he's the one he's sort of talking quietly to his friend, and there's the brilliant ideas is all Doc Simon. I can't
tell you how many times I've witnessed that in a room.
It's that they're a little on. I mean, writers have a tendency, in general, I think, to be kind of shy and reserved, except for those exceptions that are very, very loud and verbose.
Absolutely, and that was sort of something that was something that you kind of needed to do in a comedy room. You needed to pitch. If you don't pitch at all, what use are you in the writer's room? I mean, you can go off and write scripts, but if you're going to sit in that room, take up space, and take a salary, people want to hear what you have to say.
Sure.
So it's a strange thing. You're right, because most writers by nature are introverts.
Yes.
And then you get into this situation, these gang writing situations, and all of a sudden you're expected to be, incredibly social and vocal.
And it's very difficult for some people. I know that I don't know if you worked with them, but I know you knew Steve Sestarsik and David Silverman.
Yes, I never worked with them.
Well, Steve and I went to school together, and I knew Steve, forever. And he passed away, unfortunately, last year. But he was kind of an introvert, and he had to learn how to speak up. But he was brilliant. I mean, the stuff that came out of him was just brilliant. And people would wait for him to say something because he would say something that was completely off the wall. And
that is just sort of a tribute to him and the fact that people were willing to listen and wait
and wait for the gem that comes, right?
Yeah.
So
I remember I used to work with Bob Benditson and his brother Howard.
Sure, I know both of them.
Howard was the quietest guy around.
Oh, Howard's a complete introvert.
Yeah, and Bob is Bob has to kind of force himself to be out there. He's not the most out there guy either, but Bob, can speak and is good at it and everything. But Howard would be the one who would just mumble something, and it would be hilarious.
Yeah. Bob was gregarious by comparison to Howard.
But by comparison.
By comparison.
Not by nature
no.
a gregarious person. He really, you could tell he's somebody who had to get himself out there.
Exactly. I met them when they were, Steve and David and Howard and Bob were working on Alice, and I met them on that.
Oh, wow.
So they were working with Bob Carroll and Madeline Davis.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So those are legends, those two, with the Lucy show behind them and everything else they did. So all right. So most TV producing, for sure, comes, especially when you're the showrunner, it comes with heavy-duty pressure. Can you give us an example of a pressure situation and how you handled it?
Okay, I don't know if this would be considered a pressure situation, but it's something. It was something that I dealt with it as the showrunner of Home Improvement. Well, I'll give you one pressure situation and one kind of odd situation. Toward the end of Home Improvement, we had actors, who walked out, basically. They wanted their contracts renegotiated, and they didn't show up at the table for the reading of an episode. And maybe we heard about that in advance. I forgot how it all went down. But we figured, well, how are we going to do a show if they don't show up? So what we did was we wrote a one-man show episode for Tim Allen to do because we knew that he would be at the table. And so we had to kind of get that done in our spare time while we were working on the regular episodes because we knew we might need one in the hopper for that week. And so what happened was that they eventually came to terms. They showed up, and we wound up shooting that show as an extra episode.
I don't recall that show. Was it ever aired?
Yeah, it was aired.
Wow, it was a one-man show. What was it about?
I have no recollection.
I have the same problem. I can't remember what I wrote in the past either. So that's.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I understand.
But you know, this was another thing that came up. You know, I was somebody who really rose through the ranks, and by the time I was a showrunner, I was already 40. You know, and which was old by showrunner standards for comedy back then.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I had a very kind of, I was grateful. I had a measured approach. I didn't, you know, every day you would sort of learn the protocol. So one day I had an associate producer come into my office, and she was a post-production associate producer, and she said, could I get a co-producer title next year? She said, I'm not asking for more money. I just would like that title. And I said, you're not asking for money? She said, no. And I said, well, yeah, you're great. It shouldn't be a problem. So I call up the head of production at Disney, or I get a memo sent to the head of production at Disney saying that we're going to give her a promotion to co-producer without any salary increase. And I get a call on the phone from this guy saying, you know, we don't think it's a good idea to make her a co-producer.
Ooh.
I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, if you make her co-producer, it sets a bad precedent. Everybody will want to be a co-producer. And I said, but we don't have to make everybody a co-producer, just the people we want to make a co-producer. And besides, she's not asking for more money. He said, well, I think it sets a bad precedent. And I said, well, I don't really think so. And you know, we argued back and forth and back and forth. And finally I said, listen, tell me, whose decision is this ultimately? Is it yours or mine? And there's a pause. He says, it's yours. And I said, okay, she's a co-producer. He says, I really think it sets a bad precedent. I said, I'm okay with that. You know, I went back to work. So that was kind of learning on the job, you know, what to do with your power, and you know, and I always, once I got there, my sort of mantra was to use my power for good, and that if you could help somebody and they deserved it, why the hell not?
Well, which showrunner in the history of television knew what they were doing before they became a showrunner? Well,
I don't know. It all depends, I guess, on how long you're in the trenches. I was in the trenches for a long time, but it's the pressure. It's also the pressure. You don't know the pressure till you're in the hot seat.
I think that's also about artists. Artists, especially writers, tend to work alone in a room, or if they're a team, they work alone together in a room, and then suddenly they're thrust into the situation of having to run a table full of people. That's not what they're used to. So right. You have to learn your way around it. And what I'm curious about comedy itself. So I'm going to ask you what I think is a difficult question, and I've heard different answers on it over time. And that is, you know, the old saying is that dying is easy, but comedy is hard. What is it that you think makes comedy comedy? Can you define it in any way?
What do I think makes comedy comedy?
Why is some... Obviously, the easy answer is if it makes you laugh, it's comedy. But how do you then make it comedy?
I think the answer to me is surprise.
Surprise.
If something just sort of disarms you in a way that you didn't expect. I didn't see it coming. You know, it's that, and the relatability of saying, well, yeah, that's happened to me, or that could happen to me. But, you know, it's like with Larry David. He was the perfect example of that, where he was taking everyday situations and annoying things that happened to all of us and taking it to the next level. And, you know, he did this one scene, I guess, in Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Larry David, I think he has to buy scalp tickets to the High Holy Days, Jewish holidays.
Yes.
Because they sell these tickets, and they were such in demand that there was ticket scalping going on. Well, it took something that I knew about in my life to a level that was just balls out funny, because it was realistic enough and yet just comically insane.
Well, you know, comedy is just really hard to describe, and maybe it shouldn't be described. I'm just curious what folks who have been successful at it think. And I think that you're right. I think it's taking, what is common and somehow elevating it without making it completely crazy or silly. Although,
yeah, and there's so many levels of comedy. I was never a fan of broad comedy, so I didn't love all the sketch shows from early on. I liked Sid Caesar, but the stuff, there was so many sketch shows later on, and it wasn't my thing. That I was gravitating toward things that were more real.
More realistic.
In sitcom, it was All in the Family, and in film, it was Scorsese, Bogdanovich, Friedkin, whatever.
Well, my favorite personal film comedy of all time is a Bogdanovich movie called What's Up, Doc?
Right.
It's just an extraordinary movie for me. Were you a fan of Monty Python, or is that too broad for you?
Yeah. Now, Monty Python was broad, but just hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I loved the Monty Python movies. I remember going back and seeing, I guess, and now for something completely different.
Yeah.
That was the sketch compilation from the shows.
Right.
And I saw that after I started seeing the other movies. But I loved Monty Python.
Yeah, pretty much geniuses.
And then when you go back in time, to the classic Hollywood comedies, Preston Sturges.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they were broader. That was the style in those days, but they were brilliant. And then you have a movie like The Lady Eve or Sullivan's Travels, where you have comedy and pathos. That's the best.
And it's pretty hard to top Billy Wilder when he was on.
Oh my God!
Some Like It Hot is pretty good.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about collaboration. Obviously, there are solo writers and there are teams, and then you have to come together and collaborate at the table on a comedy.
Right.
Tell me about your point of view on collaboration. What makes a good collaboration work?
Just finding somebody who, first of all, kind of shares your mindset, but comes at it from a little different place than you do. Because if you're exactly the same, then why do it?
Right.
Except that maybe with two people it gets done faster. And by the way, there is truth to that. When you're under the gun on a sitcom, what I did on Home Improvement, I used to put people together to write drafts because not only these were people who were not partners, but we were all on staff together. And I used to write scripts with somebody. When I was on Home Improvement, I would write a script with somebody, and we'd knock it out in a few days. And it was so much more pleasant and so much less pressure than having to, first of all, I didn't have the time to, take 2 weeks to write a script. But it was way more fun, way less pressure to do it with a partner on a show that we were all basically mimics on anyway. And so it was very much worthwhile to collaborate in that.
So that's a huge advantage. Clearly, are there downsides that people should watch out for in collaborating?
Well, okay. So are you talking about a formal partnership?
Well, either a formal partnership or one that's important that's not formal.
Well, if it's a formal partnership and you're working on a sitcom, you get paid half the money.
Yeah.
That's really kind of annoying because when you're in the room, you are two separate people pitching just like the individual writers are pitching.
Right, sure.
Why should you get paid half of what they get paid?
Yeah.
It's really like an unfair system. I mean, I guess I understand that for the individual scripts, you might have to share it, but the way your deals are negotiated, no, I'm getting the team of Bob and Howard Bennison. They get one fee.
Yeah, that is a big disadvantage. Although if you can get up in the ranks and make enough money, it's not as painful. Can you tell when you were working on Home Improvement or any show? Can you tell in the room whether something is going to land, or do you really need to hear the actors say it?
Sometimes you think it's going to land and it falls. You just don't. I mean, there's stuff you can sort of predict, and if you're working on Home Improvement, you kind of know the types of jokes that Tim Allen can sell.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and then what may happen is that you'll go to the table for the first table reading, and Tim Allen won't like the joke. And whether or not he could sell it is never an issue because he doesn't want to do it. So you're going to change the joke.
What would you say are the most common mistakes that novice writers present?
You saying when they're first hired or before they're hired? Or?
Both. But when they're starting out and they don't know what they're doing, what are the...
Okay, here's the worst mistake.
Mm-hmm.
The worst mistake is some writer pitches a joke and the novice writer says, nah, but doesn't come up with a fix.
Uh-huh.
That is the cardinal rule. If you're going to, speak up and say, this guy's joke is no good, what do you got? And writers learn that really quickly, that if you spend your whole time being a naysayer, that story's no good, that joke's no good, and you're not pitching anything that's better, or at least trying, you're out.
I think that's valuable advice in any part of any career.
It really is, and you'd be surprised how in the world of editing and books and whatever, in all of these worlds, you're always faced with tons of rejections. And I remember once I started writing prose again, I submitted an essay to some literary magazine, and they did not accept it. But this editor wrote me an email saying, we're not taking it because we, what we want in these essays is this, and this. And she said, if you do that, resubmit it to me. I'd love to take a look at it. And this is the only time anyone in the book world has ever taken the time to be that helpful. And years later, this woman, she just published her first book, memoir, and she was coming to California for her book signing, and I made sure I was there. I made sure I bought a book, introduced myself. We'd never met, and it was fantastic. So you're right. This cuts across many, many platforms.
Yeah, it's always best to present some solution, whether it's an acceptable solution or not, it's another story, but as opposed to just saying no. And most rejection in Hollywood is pass. You don't know why.
Exactly.
And it can be frustrating because if they had just said, well, we didn't like this or that, maybe the next time out you can fix that, but you don't know what it is to fix. So
right, and those people, they cannot be expected to do. They don't have the time.
Of course not.
And quite frankly, most of them don't have the knowledge to really explain what they're looking for, why they didn't take it, whatever. And they don't have to. They're not obligated to do that. But if you're a member of a staff and you either are there, if you're the showrunner, I think you're obligated to come up with fixes and be an example.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a staff writer, you've got to learn pretty quickly that it's not just enough to say no.
So you've now done lots of work in both worlds, both in television and in writing books, both fiction and nonfiction.
Right.
Do you have a preference?
Well, as far as putting my own vision out there, books for sure.
Right.
As far as the company, I think being on a show, because I get sick of hanging around with me a lot.
Yeah, I understand. 35 years in a room alone, it gets a little old sometimes. Because, there's no one else to beat your head against. And that's very, very important.
I tell people, I said, I like this, what I do, but sometimes I get really sick of the company.
Well, Bruce, believe it or not, we've been talking for almost an hour, and
wow.
We're going to go to the famous last two questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You've had lots of experiences in the world, and we've heard a couple of very funny ones already. But I'm curious if, in your experiences, can you relate one or two offbeat, crazy, wild, silly, just straight out funny stories? Is something like that you have?
Well, I'll give you one that it's not. I don't know that it's crazy, but it will give you an insight when you talk about what is comedy, and you can't really define it, and you also asked, know if a joke will land. This is the best example of that I've ever experienced. So we were shooting an episode of Home Improvement, and it was one of these tool time scenes where they're talking about some hardware subject, and in this case it was like they were talking about door locks. And we would do these silly jokes in that section, and Tim liked these kinds of jokes, and Tim also liked to improvise, by the way. So we had this one joke where we were talking about the door locks, and meanwhile, picture all the writers and the producers and the director not being on stage. We're in a little booth, little soundproof booth away from them, and we communicate via a microphone out to the stage manager. So we shoot the scene, and one of the lines is, hey, today we're here to talk about locks. And Tim says, you got your deadbolt locks, you got your police locks, you got your bagels and locks. Okay. So these were the silly kind of jokes that they would do on the tool time thing. So after he says bagels and locks, he starts improvising and does this whole thing about bagels and blah 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 blah. So and it's as flat as a pancake, no laughs at all. The more he improvises, the worse the bigger hole he's digging himself. Right?
Yeah.
So we have the director speak through the microphone, give the stage manager a note to give to Tim that on the next take, keep it short because a little locks goes a long way. So we shoot the next take, and he does the same thing. You got your deadbolt locks, you got your police locks, you got your bagels and locks, and remember, a little locks goes a long way. And the audience laughs wildly. I mean, and so we just turned to each other and said, we don't know anything, because we gave a stage direction, he read it as a line of dialogue, and the audience laughed. What good are we?
He saw something in there that he saw was funny that the rest of you thought was just a straight direction.
And also the way he delivered it was funny. So it was just, all of these great minds getting together to try and make a funny script, and this guy takes a stage direction and makes a joke out of it.
Well, if there's one thing that I learned over years of doing what I did, was that no matter what you write, you're very fortunate if you have actors who just take it to another level.
Absolutely.
They just plus what you have there. You think this is not going to do anything, and they just twist it in a way that just makes it fantastic.
Yeah.
So do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip for those who are either just starting out? I know we've already talked about one or two, or somebody maybe that's already in the industry and looking to get to the next level.
Just be real. I mean, it sounds cliche. I mean, put your heart and soul into it. Look around at who you're working for, working with. Try and be of help the most you can be, and try to differentiate yourself from the group in a way that shows who you are individually. Because what I found, honestly, when I was working in my last year of Home Improvement, and I went on to do Sabrina after that, but in that last year of Home Improvement, I kind of wanted out. I knew I wanted out because all of the writers that were on the show by that time, all of their conversations in between the actual work was about sitcoms and other sitcom writers and what deals they had, and did you see this show? Did you see that show? And that part I liked. Did you see this show? Did you see that show? But I didn't like the talk that it was all sitcom all the time.
Right.
So I really felt like I wanted to be around writers who were looking at the world and wanting to divine something that was theirs that they could put out there. So I would say that if you're lucky enough to get the chance, don't get so insular with your friends, with your, have another world out there besides the world of television. It's hard once you're in it because the time is so demanding, But I think it's really valuable to bring stuff to the table that's not the same thing that everybody else is bringing.
Well, that's just wonderful advice. That live life is what you're saying. Don't just get caught up in the insular world of being on a staff somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds cliche, but having witnessed it actually happening, and hearing the talk of the people who were working for me, and feeling my eyes start to glaze over, by the time I got out of there, and by the time I got out of the sitcom rooms, I was and started doing books, I was so thrilled to meet all these different kinds of writers with different voices, and, one guy who wrote historical fiction, and one of my best friends now is a poet. I mean, it's just, there is a whole world out there, and it's important because we live in a world now where there's so many shows, and you can't possibly keep up with them. And I know people who try to, and they post things on Facebook like, you gotta watch whatever show they've just put on, Euphoria, whatever, Fleabag, whatever these shows are, and your first reaction is, I can't possibly keep up with all this
No
stuff.
way.
And then you start to think, is it really necessary that I can't keep up with all this stuff? And the answer is no. My advice is that pick certain things, certain books, certain TV shows, and really embrace the ones you love, and don't feel bad that you haven't seen every single Hulu series or, Comedy Central series that's on the air, because it ain't going to change your life.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's splendid advice. Sometimes I think the best advice is just turn the TV off and read a book.
So, totally. I mean, the world is so noisy right now. Quiet is just one of the most valuable commodities.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Bruce, this has been just a terrific hour and plus, a little bit plus, and I'm so happy that you came on the show and told us about your career and your upcoming book and all the things that you've done. I thank you greatly.
Well, thank you, Steve. It really was a pleasure.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.